So I'm going to start the session with two questions. First question is, do we have anyone who works in CTI in the audience? And you better put your hand up, I see you. So I want some good questions at the end, please. If I don't run over and go on crazy tangents or whatever, I'll leave some time. I would love some questions on this because I love discussing it. The second question is, who here is stressed out watching the news these days? Pretty much everybody. I find that thinking about it in these terms, abstracting it through CTI, through the cyber lens, helps me read some really depressing, sometimes scary news. And I go, oh, that's actually some useful information. I can help some customers with that, or I can pass that along to one of my coworkers or whatever. And maybe it's a coping mechanism, but it definitely does help. So there's not going to be any pictures of physical conflicts in here. This is the closest we get to anything like that in this talk, so don't worry about that. This is from the Ukrainian cyber police. I love these guys because they do really detailed videos of raids that they do on ransomware gangs. In this case, this is a SIM farm. These are SIMs. And this was a dual-use SIM farm that was used to do scams, but also to broadcast sort of Russian propaganda, so scaring people, maybe spreading misinformation, whatever. So they produce these videos where they go in, they batter the door down, they go in. You get to see them raiding guys from Klopp, guys from Revil, guys from... trying to think of other ransomware groups. There was a guy who escaped from his flat and jumped up on his roof in a bathrobe and was like waving at the police and stuff, and just a whole bunch of characters that you get to see basically them go and arrest. So it's fascinating. They give you an insight because they want obviously people to see that they're doing it. But yeah, so that's what this still is from. So, as mentioned already, I'm Cian Heasley. I'm a principal consultant at Acumen Cyber. We're an engineering-led MSSP right here in Glasgow. We're doing some really interesting work in basically making sure that SOCs are efficient, that we're able to produce an amazing service for our clients. I've got 6 years working in CTI, so my background is originally detection engineering. I did a little bit of IR. I still do a little bit of IR, but then primarily building and running CTI functions. I'm a MITRE ATT&CK and a Sigma open source detection contributor, not Sigma in the meme sense, Sigma in the open source, the open source detection sense. I'm fascinated by geopolitics and cyber, and my hobbies are history, bowling, and I put spiced rum there because I just love spiced rum. I'll probably be drinking some after this talk. So I wanted to break this talk up into 4 parts. The meat and potatoes of this are the first 3 parts, and I'll add a little prediction slide at the end. So essentially, I want to talk about CTI fundamentals because we've got 5 or 6 people here who admitted to working in the field, but the rest of you don't, so you may need some of the basics here. Then I want to talk about CTI and geopolitical risk and kind of how to discuss that, how to think about it. And then I want to make some observations. Oh, I've added an extra 2 there. We're going into the future. I'm going to talk about 2022 till now. So I'm going to explain why everything changed in 2022 and what's happened since then and how we need to sort of think about it and what that means for how things are now and also for the future, getting us on to predictions there. So we need to start with a definition of CTI. I thought about this a lot. I went back and forth on it. I edited it. Essentially, CTI is evidence-based, analyzed knowledge about adversaries, their motivations, and their behaviors, which is delivered to inform defensive decisions. And to sort of simplify that even more, CTI isn't just an IOC feed. CTI is context for decision-making. So how you're planning your defenses, whether you need extra security controls, whether your detections that you have in your SIEM or even your EDR are up to scratch, CTI will give you the context that you need to make those decisions. You don't necessarily need to have a whole CTI function to do that, but you need to base your decisions on some level as to what threats are out there right now, what the threat landscape is. It's just necessary. Otherwise, you are, I think I talk about it a bit further on in the talk, but you're essentially shooting in the dark. You don't know who is attacking you. You don't know how to defend yourself. You need to at least have some context to do that. So the 4 levels of CTI, and by the way, you can tell I didn't use AI to make these slides. Very brave of me, I know, but I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. The 4 levels of CTI, so we've got technical, tactical, operational, and strategic, and I'm going to briefly explain all 4, and I'm going to explain the outputs of all 4, examples of outputs. So technical level is the simplest to explain, SOC tooling. So the intended audience is SOC tooling. It supports real-time automation, so your IOC feeds, essentially. Whatever you're bringing in, whether it's from open source feeds or from a big provider like Recorded Future, whatever else, that's the technical level. The problem is a lot of people think about this as the beginning and end of CTI, and it definitely isn't. You should at least be getting up into the tactical and operational levels to think about those. So the tactical level, so the intended audience for this would be more detection engineers, threat hunters, so your SOC. And essentially, at this level, you're thinking about write-ups of adversary TTPs. You're thinking about current behaviors, maybe novel behaviors that are being exhibited by threat actors who are targeting your sector, or maybe it's as high level as just what are ransomware gangs doing right now? What are business email compromise gangs doing right now? What is the latest phishing technique? Are we protected from it? I've worked at MSSPs for 7 years now, and I've seen customers come in who have migrated their detections from QRadar to Splunk, from Splunk to Sentinel, but essentially those detections have stayed the same. They are, whether it's for compliance or whatever else, or they're just doing like for like, they've been carrying around the same bag of detections on their back from seam to seam, maybe for 5, 6, 7 years. Some of those detections are for things that have probably been patched out or covered by other controls. Some of those detections might be referencing logs that are no longer in existence, data sources that are gone. They're just carrying those around. It's almost like tech debt, but for detections. You have to revisit these things. You have to do gap analysis. So that's tactical. Operational. So you're looking now more at security leadership, incident response planning, and this supports decisions over weeks or months. So an example of this might be we need to review our help desk verification policies because Scattered Spider have been doing a lot of help desk voice phishing. I hate the word vishing, but we can use it if we have to. We need to revisit that. We need to make sure that we're verifying who people are properly because otherwise, we might be breached as well. So that would be an example of something there where security leadership would need to step in and say, are our current processes or security controls up to the task of protecting us from what's happening now? And then at the top level, we have board and exec level briefings, so your C-suite, your SLT, and this supports decisions over months or years. And some examples here might be you're a company that does research. Maybe you were a company who was doing research into drones in 2021. 2022 happened. Suddenly, drone warfare is a very hot topic. Have you considered that the research that you're doing might attract APT-level adversaries? Have you considered that research that might have seemed fairly innocuous a year or two ago suddenly is a very hot topic? Are you involved in maybe the oil industry and you're trying to predict how the Iran war will go for the oil industry? Iranian APTs might be interested in that information. Middle East think tanks, Russian think tanks, anything like that. As geopolitical hotspots or conflicts or whatever else happen, it changes the calculus for how valuable what you have is or who might want to do you damage for some reason. So the next thing we need to talk about, process. As I get older, I love processes. When I was younger, I used to always, we'll write up some documents. As I've gotten older, it's become something that I fall back on because I think it keeps the people following the process safe, because if they're following the process, they've done what they're supposed to do, but also keeps everyone honest. If you are given a process and you're asked to follow it, you know what you're supposed to do. So from the top down, we've got requirements and tasking. That's the beginning phase of the whole CTI lifecycle. Discovery and collection, processing, analysis, production, dissemination, and feedback, and then back into requirements and tasking. And you can break this down a couple of different ways. I've kind of merged things just to keep it neat on here. Once again, highlighting problems. A lot of people think that discovery and collection and production are the most important parts. I think that requirements and tasking and dissemination and feedback are the most important parts. If you don't know what you're collecting in the first place, your requirements, you're collecting a bunch of data. It may not be useful, it may not ever be used. It may be used, but the people getting it may not find it useful. You go through this entire cycle, you get it to the right people, so dissemination, you make sure the right people are getting that information in the form of a report, in the form of analysis, whatever else. You get their feedback. Did they find it useful? Did they even read it? Are they going to use it for anything? And then that feeds back into requirements and tasking again. Without that last step and that first step being done properly, everything in the middle is kind of just busy work potentially. And you're just spinning your wheels. So I think that's very important to note here as well. The last thing I want to talk about in CTI fundamentals is the concept of a state responsibility spectrum. Once again, I've simplified this. I think there's 9 total entries in the current accepted model of this. Essentially, you can break it up into 3 parts. You've got passive, aiding and abetting, and conducting or executing. So from passive, we have state prohibited. So that's basically crimes are illegal. Should we put it that way? It's illegal for a hacktivist group to attack other countries from your country. So essentially, the UK would be state prohibited for hacking. Then we've got state ignored, which is a little bit more complex. Either the government is not interested in prosecuting people, the legal framework doesn't cover hacking crimes properly, or the police are not equipped properly to deal with hacking. So in the 2000s, or more like the 2010s, I guess, there were a lot of anonymous subgroups that operated out of South America. And essentially, from what I could tell, they were able to operate out of there because the police were not equipped to be able to catch them. So they might have wanted to do it. They might have wanted to track these guys down and arrest them, but essentially it was state ignored because they did not have the necessary capability to catch these guys, from what I could tell anyway. We go down into abetting, so state encouraged. So at this point, we're into what we would look at from Russia. So for hacktivist groups, state encouraged. So before 2022, and I'll get into this more, there were not a lot of Russian hacktivist groups. After 2022, there were. Russia is fully capable of catching cyber criminals. If you're a Russian cyber criminal and you do ransomware on a Russian company, the FSB will kick your door in and they will take photos of them standing on your head in your living room in your pajamas or your boxer shorts. They will do it because I've seen it. If you sell an info stealer and you know that info stealer is being used in Russia or CIS, they will find you within a month. And I know this because I've seen it happen as well. There was a guy who started an info stealer called Medusa. He sold it on Russian e-crime markets. He didn't explicitly ban it from being used in Russia, and also he didn't build in the checks that check the language used on the computer. And within a month, he was arrested publicly, shown on TV, in a cage in a courtroom. So they're perfectly capable of catching these guys if they want to. Then we get into state coordinated. So some of the Russian hacktivist groups, and I'll get into that a bit more as well, are actively aided by the Russian government, according to intel from the US government and just my own observations, I think. And they are given some idea as to targeting. So it might be NATO nations, it might be, France is shipping missiles to Ukraine this week, make sure and attack French businesses, make sure and cause some trouble. And then we're down into the APT level, which is state ordered, which is an interesting one. There is a group, actually I'll just skip to the next slide. There's a group called Ghost Rider. And they are apparently a Belarus military unit who are basically tasked by the Russian government to do operations when the Russian government doesn't have the bandwidth to do it. So they're not directly controlled by the Russian government, but they are essentially ordered to do work for the Russian government. So that's state ordered. And then state executed is your nation-state APT from the nation that's ordering them. So Fancy Bear in Russia or Lazarus in North Korea. Also state encouraged, I would say, and we'll get onto this a bit more, Russian ransomware groups. That's an easy one. You could also say Iranian ransomware groups, because there are a few. So hopefully that all makes sense to everyone. When you hear people say stuff like all ransomware groups are carried out by the Russian government and they're ordered to do it by the Russian government, that's not exactly true. Like, first of all, not all ransomware groups are Russian, and second of all, they're generally told to put it bluntly, don't shit where you eat. Don't target Russian businesses, don't target Chinese businesses, don't target Cuban businesses, don't target CIS, so the former Commonwealth states around Russia, don't target them. I believe sometimes they are directly asked to target specific enterprises or sectors or whatever, but in general, it's state encouraged. So they're told, we will not mess with you if you do what we need you to do when we ask you, and the rest of the time you stay away from any targets so we do not want you to mess with, or countries. So we get on to CTI and geopolitical risk, which is sort of the main focus of all of this now that we've gone through the fundamentals. Older people in the audience, you will remember this phrase. It's kind of wiped it out there. Cyber Pearl Harbor. It used to be a drinking game. When you heard Cyber Pearl Harbor, you could do a shot. This is an article from July of 1996, so almost exactly 30 years ago. And I'm not sure this was the first time this phrase was ever used, but essentially the big fear in the 90s, because hacktivism started becoming a thing, people started realizing, hey, we've got some sensitive data online, the internet's scary, security's terrible. The idea was that basically a cyber war would be the equivalent of a physical war. So we've kind of been promised this for 30 years. It hasn't really come to pass. The closest we've seen to it is essentially in Ukraine with Russia, and maybe some stuff that North Korea has done to South Korea, like big sort of wiper attacks or whatever else. I love the illustration at the top. I think that maybe is a Spark 20 that they've put in there with the planes flying overhead. I also love the genies are back in the bottle, and it's control the filthy internet. We're still fighting that battle as well 30 years later. Honestly, of the two, Cyber Pearl Harbor or free speech online, this is probably the one that still keeps people up at night more than whether we'll actually see an entire nation decimated by cyber attacks. But I just wanted to put this in its context because while we're talking about the cyber aspect of geopolitics, the actual bombs and bullets and everything else flying are the really important part. The people who are getting blown up or shot or whatever else. This is just a cyber aspect of that. And it is in conjunction with that, and it does feed into that, but it's definitely not the most important part. It's what we're talking about here today because, hey, this is a cybersecurity conference. So, adversary goals. And here we're thinking about not the top part of the state spectrum. We're thinking about the abetted and the encouraged. So, we've essentially got 4 goals that a geopolitically motivated attacker has. So, number 1, we've got knowledge. So that's essentially espionage. So that's theft of intel, theft of data, theft of IP. So it could be drone plans, it could be bomb plans, it could be Russia wants to know how aid convoys are getting to Ukraine, so they're hacking cameras so they can watch. Or it could be they want to know if bombs have landed successfully on their targets. Iran was doing this for a while, where they would hack cameras that they knew were in the area of somewhere that they'd struck with a missile to make sure that they'd actually hit the right target. So that's something that's very hot right now with adversaries. Profit is an obvious one, so theft, extortion, and fraud. If we're thinking about that, I think North Korea would probably be our most obvious answer. You know, they need to prop up their economy. So it's stealing cryptocurrency. It's maybe Iran committing extortion through ransomware groups that they have as a front for their APTs, apparently. Or it's fraud. So somewhere along there, it's all about getting money or potentially getting money. We get into influence, which is also fairly obvious. Disinformation is easy enough to define. You're trying to scare people, you're trying to mislead people, you're trying to muddy the waters of what people know. Coercive operations is a bit more interesting. This is a cyber attack that is essentially designed to demonstrate capability. So it may not have a direct link to the next thing, which is physical war, but you might turn off all the lights in a city to show that you can do it. You might I think Israel was accused of basically wiping a bank in Iran that was used by the Iranian government to potentially launder money. It may not have had a direct influence on the, and I hate the phrase kinetic, because it always sounds a bit Jason Bourne, the actual warfare itself, but it's something that scares people or scares the leadership of a country. So you're making them nervous. Apparently this happens because it's a projector, so just give it a second. There we go. And finally, you have war, which is kinetic support. So some of what I talked about up in espionage might feed in here. So you might want to hack webcams to see if you are targeting the right places with missiles. But equally, you know, in Ukraine, there's been attacks on energy infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure, internet infrastructure to try and cut off communications. So if you're attacking a certain area, you can basically degrade their ability to respond quickly. So, you know, you're basically stopping them from using infrastructure to respond quickly or respond at all to an attack. So that's our 4 adversary goals. If we're thinking about your own organization or your own business or whatever else, you know, these are some of the goals to think about essentially as motivations for somebody who might have an interest in attacking your organization. This next point I wanted to make, so destructive and disruptive attacks are increasing in frequency. So if you think about physically disruptive attacks in the last 10, 15 years, before 2022 especially, you probably think about something like Colonial Pipeline, which was the attack by DarkSide ransomware. They hacked a large oil pipeline company in America, and they essentially ransomwared it, and it shut down. The interesting thing from what I can work out about that, after having read a lot about it afterwards, is the actual pipeline itself was fine. The OT, SCADA, everything that ran the pipeline was fine. The reason they shut it down was because they couldn't bill for the oil. They couldn't measure how much oil it was flowing. So it didn't essentially shut down the pipeline itself. It essentially did because they had to do it because of billing issues. But I found that interesting. At the time, I think the narrative in the media was that the pipeline itself had literally shut down because of the ransomware. So that wasn't the case. But since 2022, and that incident was 2021, since 2022, we've seen a lot more disruptive and destructive attacks. It's just becoming more of a fact of life. I'm going to talk about 4 of them here. So from top left, up there, that is an attack in July of 2022 that has been claimed by a group called Predatory Sparrow. A lot of people believe that they are an Israeli APT. And essentially what they did was they caused in Iran, in an Iranian factory, an uncontrolled release of molten metal, which basically sparked a massive fire. And essentially the workers had to put that out. The factory was out of operation. On the top right here, we have a UAE TV streaming hack that is attributed to Iranian APTs, and they had this weird deep-faked news anchor speaking over various Gaza war footage. So it was basically an attempt to get people in the UAE thinking about how Iran thought that UAE was complicit in the situation in Gaza, essentially. And they were able to take over the stream. I think it was for maybe 30, 45 minutes, and basically broadcast whatever they wanted. Down in the bottom left is July 2025. That is when Aeroflot was essentially kind of ransomware. It was really a wiper attack by two groups, Belarusian cyber partisans, who are apparently a group of Belarusian hacktivists who hate the Belarusian government, and a Ukrainian group called Silent Crow. And basically what they did was they were able to get access to Aeroflot, all of their systems, all of their servers, their cloud infrastructure and everything, and wiped everything. And they posted some pretty funny photos at the time of the fact that Aeroflot was basically using unlicensed Windows. I think it was like Windows 8 maybe, something crazy, to run most of their stuff. So they were able to get in and wipe everything, and as a result, flights were disrupted, travel basically came to a standstill. This is a photo from a Moscow airport, basically showing a lot of red and delayed and everything, and essentially Aeroflot was out of commission for a few days. And then finally down here in the bottom right, we have the recent attacks on water systems, water treatment facilities and such forth in America. This is Minnesota specifically, but I think it's 5 different states. And these attacks have been attributed to a group called Cyber Avengers, who are, once again, sort of a hacktivist front for, it's suspected, an IRGC Cyber Electronic Command Unit, CEC. So I'm actually in 3 different Telegram chats with the guys from Cyber Avengers, and one of the guys who seems to lead the group, they actually issued a denial that they were involved in this for whatever reason. Obviously, attribution is difficult, like it gets very muddy, but it's interesting that they actually created a new Telegram channel just to specifically say, actually, we didn't do this for whatever reason, they felt they need to deny it. So in this case, there was access gained to a lot of different water treatment facilities, and then there was tampering with the controls there. I think most of it was caught before any damage was caused, but there were some places which basically went without water while they were checking over the systems and doing incident response. So these are just 4 examples. There's a lot more. TV hacks have increased in numbers. A lot of it involves Iran, so it's people hacking Iranian TV or Iran hacking TV networks around them. But it's definitely something that's on the rise. And then these OT SCADA attacks are just generally increasing. So questions that you need to ask yourself as an organization. First of all, on the right, anyone familiar with this? It's a company called Stryker. They are a medical device company, and they owned an Israeli subsidiary, or they still own an Israeli subsidiary. Handler Group, which is another supposedly hacktivist front. There seems to be heavy evidence that it is, for an Iranian APT, were able to get on, and they were able to take control of Intune in the corporation and basically wipe all devices that were enrolled in Intune. And then when you tried to sign in, you got their logo in the background, and this just basically says, your sign-in was unsuccessful. So the questions that you have to ask yourself, what is your organizational exposure? Someone who's worked at an MSSP for years, you talk to clients and you say, do you think you have any organizational exposure? No, we're fine. There's no reason that any geopolitical events would impact on us. But actually, wait a minute. We do have a subsidiary that has a group of developers who are in Russia. Okay, well, that's interesting. Or actually, we do have a supplier who is part of a company that operates in occupied areas of the West Bank and have actually been called out by the UN for that. Okay, well, that's a potential problem as well. The one that always stands out to me is a company that turned out to be owned by a Chinese billionaire. I didn't know they were, and they sort of dropped that information after I'd been talking to them for a while. And they said, what does that mean for us? And I was like, well, I'd have to go away and look, but it's definitely important context that we had never discussed before. It turned out that he was quite close to the Chinese political leadership. So, I mean, I guess that's a plus for them, but still, it's something that they hadn't even thought of to mention to us as something that might be an issue. Is there potential for collateral risk or collateral damage? So it may be that you are using systems that are also dual purpose for military. It might be something like NotPetya or WannaCry, where it's just indiscriminate. You know, you're in a country that's being targeted for attacks, and you know the phone systems are taken out, the electricity systems are taken out. So potential for collateral damage is important. Where is your greatest third-party risk, and are they exposed geopolitically? So, like I said there, you might have a supplier who is also working with the US military, or is also involved in aid convoys or logistics for Ukrainian aid, something like that. Something that you wouldn't necessarily think about before, but you know you need to consider, because that is something that could definitely come back and impact your organization. Is your organization in a high-risk sector? So the high-risk sectors, in my opinion, are C&I, so energy, water and telecoms, defense and aerospace, higher education, specifically around think tanks, research into areas that I talked about previously there, and government and businesses that work closely with governments. And that could be local government, or it could be national government. There was a local government in a state in the US, I think it might have been Texas, that was hacked. And the incident response pointed to the fact that it was Chinese APTs that did it. And people said, why would they bother hacking like some local government in Texas? It turned out a large Chinese corporation was trying to buy land there to do some development. And the theory afterwards was essentially they were looking to see if there was going to be any permitting issues or if there was any opposition from local government. So once again, they would never have thought that that was something that was an option, that's something that would have happened, but you know, they were targeted with like a highly sophisticated attack as a result to try and gather that information that was needed for context. Do you have operational dependencies near conflict zones? So AWS keeps having buildings that are damaged or blown up in the Middle East right now. That's happened a few times. It's something now that is a known issue, and I think it's something that we'll see in other geopolitical conflicts because it's an easy win. You know, these data centers are large, they're easy to find, you know, they're easy to target, they're not going to have air defense systems or anything. If you can cause damage to those, you can damage anybody that's connected to that, any sort of economic activity or anything else, or even maybe military operations that are using AWS or anything else. So, and do your IR plans cover ideologically motivated attacks? So in the case of Stryker, if this had been a ransomware group, they probably wouldn't have wiped all the devices. They probably would have encrypted some data, and there would have been negotiations. There would have been an option to say, hey, we'll give you some money to fix this or to drag things out before the attack was revealed. There'd be some opportunity there to discuss it with them potentially and you know, negotiate. In this case, there was nothing. Everything was just wiped. There is no negotiating with these guys. There's no talking to them. There's no getting your data back. So your IR plan might feature you know, a ransomware scenario where you know, you can get on a chat with them and you can say, hey, we'll get our cyber insurance guys in here, we'll talk to you, we'll negotiate with you. If it's ideologically motivated, that idea goes out the window entirely. It's just not going to be possible. So it's something that you have to consider if you think that any of these factors basically apply to you or your organization. So observations from 2022 till now, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think have changed since 2022 that people maybe who are not thinking about these things, they're still thinking in terms of pre-Ukraine war in how they think about threats and how to assess those threats. So first of all, I wanted to open with this. Ransomware is, and you could say it's a security problem, it's a financial problem, it's a cryptocurrency problem, and those things are all true. It's also a geopolitical problem. This country down here is Belgium. And listen, this is the one thing in the whole talk that I'm a little bit nervous about because we can argue about these statistics, but ransomware.live basically spiders all of the ransomware extortion blogs, collects all of the victims there, and then does some analysis on them, and then provides back statistics. So these are what my statistics are based on. But in 2025, there were 45 victim organizations in Belgium. In 2025, there were 44 victim organizations in the People's Republic of China. To put that into perspective, there are about 12 million people in Belgium. There are 1.4 billion people in China. And if you think about this, and if you're a CTI person, there's been one major ransomware attack involving a Chinese organization or business that was attributed to a Russian group in the last, say, 5 years, and it was Lockbit. They hit the ICBC, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, in, I think it was last year or the year before. But they hit the US broker part of it. They didn't hit the actual main organization. They hit a subsidiary that operated in the US. And even that was considered shocking at the time. That was big news. So if we're thinking in terms of ransomware, it's easy to think of it as security financial cryptocurrency. It's also really a geopolitical problem because essentially the people who are committing a lot of ransomware outside of groups like Scattered Spider that might be more Western based, and I don't like Western as a term either, but hey, that's what we've got, are in countries where they are permitted to do this or even actively encouraged to do it. It's important to think about it in that way. So I've talked about how everything changed in 2022. I don't know if anyone recognizes this on the right. This is a statement by Conti Ransomware Group. And essentially, this is a statement that they made when the Ukraine war broke out to say, hey, we back the Russian government on this. We are patriotic. We are happy to support this war. This essentially destroyed their group completely. It turned out that a large portion of their operators and some of their leadership were actually Ukrainian, and they did not agree with this. So this whole thing wound up with all of their chat logs, their documentation, because they had a lot of documentation on how to carry out ransomware attacks. All of that stuff got leaked. And there was a lot of information that was able to be gathered from those. But also we have Ukraine creating the IT army of Ukraine. Before that, there hadn't really been an openly professionalized or encouraged hacktivist group created by a nation state that was publicly acknowledged. Essentially, they said, hey, if you are opposed to Russia or if you support, the goals of Ukraine staying an independent and free state, we're happy to have you in. And there's probably some of you seen massive Telegram channels where people go and talk and discuss and plan operations and everything else. There hadn't really been anything like that before. And then Russia, obviously, there were groups that started up there. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those in a little bit. Jumping past Conti, because I've already discussed them. Russian e-crime forums carried pledges of allegiance to the Russian state. So similarly, again, this was, cyber criminals openly saying, hey, we back the Russian state here. We'll do what we can. We'll do whatever is necessary to support Russian military aims. And Russia began, and there's a lot of evidence for this, outsourcing some of their Ukraine cyber ops to criminal groups. So essentially saying, once again, we lack bandwidth to do this, or we want plausible deniability. So here we'll give you targeting, we'll give you the necessary information or whatever to target specific organizations that we want you to hit. And then we have Sandworm deploying ICS malware against civilian heating infrastructure. This was in 2024. The malware was called Frosty Goop by Dragos. And this in itself is like a big deal. If you think about ICS-specific malware, in general, malware will attack the HMI. So you'll have in some cases, a Windows 3.1 machine that you'll use to talk to the ICS systems. It'll be the human-machine interface. In this case, it directly attacked the ICS system itself and shut it down. And that actually took out heating to, I think it was 600 buildings in Ukraine during a cold snap. So it was extremely cold at that moment. It was during the winter in 2024. They were able to just basically stop those systems from working, that heating facility. So that was a big deal. The other ones that you think about in terms of ICS are literally like Stuxnet and Indestroyer. Like it's a rare thing that you see, and the fact that it's now being deployed against civilian infrastructure during a conflict shows you, I guess, how things have progressed, how quickly things have progressed. And then we have Russian state-backed hacktivists begin making global alliances. I could probably do a whole talk on that. There are so many groups. There's dozens of groups. There's a couple big alliances. They've made alliances with so Cambodian hacktivists, Middle Eastern hacktivists of various, ideological, religious persuasions. They constantly grow, they break up, they reform. At one point, there were Pakistani hacktivists and Indian hacktivists aligned with the same Russian group, even though they themselves were in active conflict. So it's very fluid at times as to who's in these groups. but they're now able to basically call the shots because the Russian groups are better organized and better funded. So they're able to say, this week we're attacking, Belgium, and those other groups will assist them on some level or publicize those attacks or whatever else they can do to basically make those attacks more effective. Talking a little bit about different adversaries and different goals, and this is extremely high level. So Russia, they have operations integrated with the Ukraine war aims, and that really is the only thing that Russia is worried about. There was various Russian hacktivist groups that were aligned with Iran. When the original Iran-Israel conflict broke out, I went to see what No Name 05716 were talking about. They were attacking Japan for sending missiles to Ukraine, or some sort of military technology. I can't even remember now. They were not interested at all. After, I think, about 2 weeks of bombing, they half-heartedly had a day or two of attacking Israeli targets. But for the most part, all they cared about was Ukraine. During the most recent Iran-Israel-America conflict, they were more interested. So for whatever reason, I think they saw it as more of an existential threat to Iran, so they started getting more involved. There was a lot more attacks on Israeli companies and everything else. But initially, they just kept on going with their whatever they were thinking about for NATO countries, basically. So for Russia, the tradecraft will be wipers. And there's a lot of wiper attacks. Some of them are more publicized than others. Oh, my goodness. But, basically getting in, destroying as much as possible, and, doing as much as possible to make sure that things are not recoverable. Hacktivist proxies, so I've talked about that, and I'll talk about it a bit more. And then criminal outsourcing, so ransomware groups. In the Conti leaks, there was a few different conversations that were talking about putting on their pioneer hats, which is kind of like the Boy Scouts, but the pioneers were Soviet volunteers who would help out, like kids that would help out the Russian state doing things. And they talked about having meetings at the Kremlin and talking to people from the FSB in very vague terms. And we know that from the chat logs that were leaked. So there's definitely some aspects there of collaboration between the groups. For China, espionage and increasingly CNI pre-positioning. So China used to be very involved in IP theft and sort of industrial espionage, that kind of thing. Increasingly, it is CNI pre-positioning as well. I actually worked an incident for a UK water company, I won't say which one, where there was a 0-day used, and it was on an edge device, and it was malware that's basically only attributed to Chinese APT threat actors. And essentially what they'd done is they tried to put a beacon on there using remote code execution. Something had gone wrong. They pre-compiled it all, I guess, for what they thought the operating system would be on the edge device, and I guess they'd done it wrong because it didn't properly call back. But I mean, that was definitely a case there where they were basically doing a mass exploitation campaign, exploiting everything possible, and the devices that were targeted were ones that are frequently used in CNI. So that's something that they're pre-positioning either for some sort of a conflict or just to know that they have that access that they can use if they need to. And obviously with China, you have living off the land, edge device compromises I've talked about, and long dwell times. So if you're not worried about causing destruction, you can just stay on networks as long as possible, collect as much data as possible, whatever else. North Korea, I've mentioned already, propping up the regime, revenue generation and crypto theft. So the fake IT worker program, there's been some really interesting articles written about people in the US who've been arrested for basically having a laptop farm in their house. They were told that they were helping people out who couldn't get visas and that they wanted to work, whether they believed that or not, or they knew that was true or not. They were told, hey, these guys, they don't have visas in the US, but if you put their laptop in your house, we'll give you some money, and they can just get on with their job. So generative AI-enabled identity fraud, so essentially just making sure that the fake IT worker program functions properly, having deep-faked job applicants and everything else, and cryptocurrency theft, so targeting cryptocurrency exchanges to steal money to help basically make sure that they can continue their economic progress under heavy sanctions. Iran down at the bottom, we have espionage, regional military, and political goals. So targeting governments in the Middle East, targeting think tanks that deal with the Middle East itself, targeting anything to do with oil revenue or essentially ways that they can predict energy markets, renewables, anything like that. They're extremely interested in progress made in the energy industry that might undermine their main source of revenue. And there we have ransomware as an influence op. So there was a bunch of attacks against US companies that were linked to essentially Iranian APT operators working with different ransomware groups to basically disrupt and then refuse to negotiate. Essentially similar to a wiper attack then. The data is encrypted, you're not getting it back. And then hacktivist persona proxy. So I've talked about Cyber Avengers and Handala as two. There are definitely other ones as well, but those are the two that you're probably going to come across. So I've talked about geopolitical conflicts in a general sense. I think it's easy to forget just how many there have been since 2022. So Russia-Ukraine obviously is still ongoing, and there's APT involvement, the start of the Hacktivist Alliance that I've talked about. It's definitely a hot spot, and it's created a lot of new alliances, but also new techniques used by hacktivist groups. Azerbaijan and Armenia had a conflict in September 22 and September 2023. Around these conflicts, hacktivist attacks tend to peak, and then they go on. So there's already regional tensions between them. There were groups that pre-existed that were already attacking each other. Israel and Iran, so there was April and October 2024 and June 2025. There was a lot of APT activity on both sides there. So there were attacks against CNI in Israel by cyber avengers, and there were also attacks on oil companies and banks and TV stations in Iran that were widely suspected to be part of Israeli APT operations. And India-Pakistan in May of 2025 had a brief border conflict. I've seen some analysis of this that said that there was a very fast spike in hacktivist activity afterwards, and how this pointed to the fact that hacktivism is evolving to move quicker. If you know India and Pakistan, and if you followed defacements, website defacements in the 90s, Indian hackers and Pakistani hackers have been at some sort of cyber war now since 1998. There have been mass defacements of websites, government websites. There are entire groups on Telegram that basically just exist to go back and forth. If there's any kind of significant dates, there'll be, there was a terrorist attack in India that was attributed to terrorists who originated in Pakistan. There'll be a massive attack against Pakistani infrastructure by Indian hacktivists, and so on and so forth. So you can't read too much into how that response went, because there were a ton of groups that already existed basically to be involved in those attacks and have been since 1998 in some form or other. And Cambodia, Thailand is similar. So a lot of the Cambodian groups ended up allying with Russian groups, because in Thailand they're extremely strict on hackers. So there weren't a lot of Thai hacktivists for them. So I think in the end they just said, we'll align with the Cambodian groups instead. And some of those Cambodian groups now have gone on to talk about getting into ransomware, which is something I'll talk about a bit more as well. So that's basically a summary of the major ones that we've seen. And this, I guess, goes back to what I'm saying. Geopolitical conflict and tension is something that we just have to factor in now. This is just in the last 4 years, and things do not seem to be calming down. So I've talked a bit about this. The cadence of cyber attacks leading up to armed conflicts increase. So even before there's an armed conflict, there'll be obvious tensions. If nation states themselves are involved in directing APT activity because they know there's a conflict coming up, obviously they're going to pre-position, they're going to carry out attacks. Theft of valuable data, potential destruction of valuable systems, and then the intensity of cyber attacks alongside armed conflict. So as I said, in Ukraine, it's something that is seen frequently on the battlefield, where there will be a military attack, but simultaneously there'll also be some sort of cyber attack that goes alongside it. And I've talked already about this. Cross-pollination of tactics across groups is interesting, because OT vandalism, as I call it, is something that's increasingly popular among these groups. Originally it was Russian groups, so they would find an exposed SCADA or HMI interface, and they would go on, they'd press a bunch of buttons, try and overheat boilers. They take a video of the whole thing and put some Russian techno over it and put it on Telegram. It's usually a 2 or 3 minute long video. There's always like klaxons and air raid sirens, and it's always sort of weird, dark techno music that they put over it. But each of these new armed conflicts that's happened has created new alliances. So in the case of Azerbaijan and Armenia, I think Armenian hackers are now, some of them are aligned with Russia. Israel and Iran, a lot of hacktivist groups didn't really step in, regional ones in the Middle East, to help Iran, but they were all united in the fact that they wanted to attack Israel. So there were some groups that actually originally, when that conflict, the first conflict in April, they had said, let's also attack Iran. And then their supporters basically, and I watched this happen in real time on Telegram, said, you can't attack Iran when they're being attacked by Israel. You need to support Iran, or at the very least attack Israel. So there was dissent even there as to what side to take. And these conversations happen in real time sometimes, where within these groups themselves, people will disagree and they'll say, no, we need to take a side on this. And yeah, down here at the bottom, defense, aviation, and aerospace are frequent targets. So Russian hacktivists love targeting transport. So you might go to a ticketing site for the train, or the site to get the tram times in your city, or whatever else. That's an easy way for them to cause disruption that people will notice. Because if they take out a local government website, you might not know when to put your bins out, but you can probably work it out. But if you can't buy a ticket for the train, or you can't work out what time you're going to get the bus or whatever, it causes a lot more problems that people actually notice. And then obviously airports the same. Plane flights, anything else that they can try and basically get in the way of to make sure that you notice the disruption, they'll do that. So we're talking about, I guess, the return of hacktivism in a way. After about 2015, Anonymous was greatly degraded in their ability to do anything because they'd all been arrested or had basically dropped out of Anonymous. Cyber Army of Russia Reborn came along in 2022 and started attacking US CNI. They were sanctioned by the US Treasury and then sort of disappeared. Based on some legal documents of people who were arrested in Ukraine and sent to America. I think it's Victoria Dubrovna is the name of the person who's arrested. Cyber Army of Russia Reborn basically rebranded as No Name 05716 and Z-Pentest. And they have been linked by the US government to Russia's GRU and specifically Sandworm. So they were receiving, the guy's handle was Cyber Ice Killer, I think, from GRU, which I find really funny, really ridiculous. But they were being told basically who to target, and they're given money to basically do their operations. No Name 05716 and Z-Pentest never ask for donations. They never try and sell anything. They're one of the only Russian groups that don't try and sell a training course on how to be a hacker, or a Raspberry Pi that's supposed to de-authenticate Wi-Fi or whatever else. All the other groups are trying to sell things to basically get money in. These guys never do, and it's, I think, fairly obvious that they're getting funded. And then Cyber Avengers down at the bottom here, I've already talked about a bit. Attacking HMI, so human-machine interfaces, SCADA, OT, in the CNI sector in the US and Israel. What's interesting about Cyber Army of Russia Reborn is they attacked CNI in the US and Europe. After they got sanctioned, no Russian groups tend to target the US. Even when Victoria Dubrovna, who was part of Z-Pentest, got arrested, Z-Pentest put out angry statements about the US, but they did not attempt to target any CNI in the US at all. They've just basically stopped doing that for whatever reason, whether it's because they're afraid of sanctions, or it's a political thing, or they're told not to. No Russian groups in terms of hacktivism tend to target the US anymore. There's a $10 million reward for information on the Cyber Avengers, which I find kind of funny because the leader of Cyber Avengers is a guy called Mr. Soul, and I'm in his Telegram chat, and he has a Gmail address. So I'm sure someone else has noticed that, but I just find it a bit funny that he's not even, he didn't even use like Proton Mail or something. He's just on Gmail. For a while, they were trying to sell the stuff they were using to hack CNI until the latest conflict broke out, and then they've gone back active, I guess. But for a while, they just seem to have decided to just sell their tools to make a bit of money on the side. And as I mentioned earlier, they've been linked to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Command Cyber Electronic Command, so specifically a cyber unit within the IRGC. I wanted to finish out here talking about a couple of things. So people think of DDoS as sort of, just nothing, like it doesn't really matter that much. It's easy to shrug off. In November of last year, so just before last Christmas, the entire French Postal Service's infrastructure was taken down. People couldn't access their bank accounts, packages weren't delivered properly, people going to the post office were turned away. I don't know how this happened, I don't know how they did have mitigations in place, but this basically affected the whole of France just before Christmas. So DDoS can actually have real-world impact. Not always, and I still don't fully understand how they weren't able to defend against this, but we do tend to shrug it off and see it as something that's not an issue. It can definitely sometimes be an issue. Predictions. More and more hacktivists will branch out into ransomware. So this is an interesting group called Infrastructure Destruction Squad. They claim to have a ransomware called BlackNet00. They make a lot of claims about it. It can do OT, it can do all this stuff. I don't necessarily believe it. They're a weird group in that none of the other Russian groups ever reference them. All the other Russian groups are either in conflict with each other or reposting each other or talking about each other. These guys are never mentioned by any other group, and I don't really understand why. I find that kind of fascinating. This post advertising this ransomware for sale was actually reposted by a group called 313 Team, who claim to be an Iraqi Shia Muslim hacktivist group that have attacked a bunch of, they've attacked Blue Sky and Outlook and a bunch of other websites that they've tried to take down. They love doing DDoS, and they sell DDoS services. But a lot of groups are getting interested in ransomware. Now, whether they can actually pull it off or not, I don't know. But it definitely changes the calculus if more and more non-Russian groups become involved in ransomware, because the countries that they will target or won't target will change. Currently, most of Russian ransomware is targeting NATO countries. If other countries or other people have ideological motivations for doing ransomware, that will all change as well. More and more APTs will adopt ransomware personas, so they can make money doing it, they can cause damage, and they have plausible deniability. It's perfect for them. They can become operators or affiliates for currently existing groups, so Killin is an example. They have an entire section on their website right now for South Korea. It's called South Korea Leaks or something. A bit strange that they've decided to target one nation to the point that they're actually creating a separate leak site for them. And I think close operations will become more commonplace. So physically going somewhere, trying to get on the Wi-Fi. Apparently, Scattered Spider tried to do this with Marks and Spencer's. They tried to hire someone to physically go to the headquarters with a laptop and get on the Wi-Fi. Russian APT people have also done this. They've also hired people to wander around with Wi-Fi rigs. I think around The Hague, there was recently some teenagers arrested for that. Nation-state hackers posing hacktivists will become standard. It just works. We've seen this since 2016, since the DNC hack. You set up a group, you release data, you put out narratives, whatever else you need to do. It works well. Geopolitical conflicts will drive the creation of these personas. So if you see a hacktivist group suddenly appear when the bombing starts, and they're really well organized, and they have a lot of tools, and they're releasing a lot of data, or they're making a lot of statements, you can say that immediately is suspicious. The speed of hacktivist mobilization around events will increase, either because they're better organized or because they're backed by nation states. And the technical ceiling for genuine hacktivist operations will also rise. So even if they're not backed by nation states, I think, and I haven't really mentioned AI in this because I'm an AI skeptic and I get tired of hearing about AI, I think it will genuinely help some of these groups that are less technically capable branch out from DDoS. They'll be able to pull off more ambitious attacks. I don't know how much time I have for Q&A, but if I run out, please come and find me outside. 2 minutes. Any questions?
Hi, first off, fantastic talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I am quite curious how you were able to attribute No Name as state coordinator, I believe. I'm just curious what kind of got you to that sort of like...
So the Victoria Dubrovna, who was arrested in Ukraine and sent to the US, if you go through her court documents, and it is from the US government, look, it's from the US Department of Justice, they were able to, I guess, seize from her computers conversations that were had in group chats with the leadership of No Name. There's a group called, it's an NGO called CISM. It's something like the Organization for the Protection of Russian Youth. It's a state-funded NGO. Apparently, a lot of the leadership of No Name 05716 are employees of that organization. And essentially, it was originally set up to monitor the internet to make sure that the youth weren't being influenced by the West, like by America, the UK, whatever. Then it became a way to recruit young hacktivists and people into the organization to run as personas. I can send you the documents, but that's where Cyber Ice Killer and everything else comes from, as people that they were speaking to from the GRU or whatever else, and the money trail basically of how they're paid to take part in No Name.
I've got my business card on me. I'll give it to you later on. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes.
It's kind of like a slightly deviated from talk, but like related. So like I saw the news the other day that the White House was set up a program where private companies could basically...
Horrible idea. Cyber mercenaries, basically. You can hack back. Yeah. It's funny because the US says that you can't trust Chinese cybersecurity companies because they work for the Chinese state. The US is going to have the exact same problem. If you have a company that's allowed to hack other countries and break the law in other countries, how are you going to then sell those services to people in other countries? Also, Russia would be within their rights to say, you've actually committed crimes in Russia, hacking a ransomware group. We want your company to be sanctioned. We want your people to be arrested. It's a dangerous thing. There's collateral damage potential there as well. If they hack a ransomware group that's on shared hosting with somebody else and they wipe servers or whatever else, it's just, I think it's bad to encourage anyone to break the law, especially private companies. And it may, the White House can say it's legal, but on the other end, it's not going to be, and countries are not going to like it, and it's muddying the waters, I think, as to whether you can criticize other countries for doing the same. So that's my thoughts on it. That's it. Thanks very much for attending, and thanks to the organizers.